Good morning, fellow AAPOR members. How are you? Well, this is a wonderful occasion. I'm here as the president-elect to introduce our speaker today. It's a very special speaker. I want to tell you a little bit about Paul and my experiences with him over this last year. When I first was informed, actually I knew that the duties of the vice president are to introduce the president of AAPOR for his presidential election. Typically, you say a few words. You do roasting. I'm not going to do roasting. Sorry, guys. Oh, come on. But we'll have a little bit of fun anyway. So typically what happens, they hand you their resume, right? 60-page CV. I almost needed a dolly to walk this in. It's actually quite an accomplished thing, set of accomplishments that I'll talk about. But I did consider entering the data into NVivo and doing some qualitative analysis, maybe a few word clouds or something. But actually, I promised to be brief at the request of Paul, but I do have a few things to say. First, I want to tell you the type of person that Paul is. He's a complete human being like all of us. He's a regular guy. On the one hand, he's a total, I actually had the words hopelessly devoted family man, deeply devoted family man. He has a wife, Barbara. Is she here? No. Oh. Hi, Barbara, wherever you are.
She asked if she should come, and I said, you've never come before, so why?
Oh, man. Well, we're already having some fun here. Actually, they've been together for 47 years. That's amazing. And he has a dad who is in his 99th year, which bodes well for your genes and also bodes well for AAPOR because we look forward to many more years of service. And an adult son, Nicholas, who lives in Australia. He has a life outside of research that includes an avid biker. He grows orchids. Did anybody know that? He tends to his pet snails with the orchids and papyrus. He's an avid reader of novels, science fiction and the like. Also, he and Barbara like to watch movies. They have a catalog of 800 DVDs. Not bad. If you multiply that by 3, how many hours of viewing is that? And I hope your home has a theater too, by the way. So that sort of gives you a flavor of his personal life. So let me talk a little bit about his professional career. As you know, I am from the University of Michigan. And it was interesting that I looked at Paul's education credentials, and he got his BA in social science from Michigan State. And anyone who knows Michigan knows them's fighting words. And he also got an MA and PhD from Loyola University in Chicago in social psychology. What I thought was particularly fascinating was that his master's thesis, why are you laughing?
Well,
was entitled Female Preferences for Male Physiques. It was so good that he got a citation in Psychology Today.
there actually was a question on Hollywood Squares one year about those results.
You should have told me that.
I never have gotten more news coverage than.
When I saw that, I got really excited about the presidential address. I thought he was going in a different direction. But the geek that I am, when I saw the actual title, I said, hey, yeah, that works too. So his over 35-year career spanned both academic and private institutions. The bulk of his career being in 2 academic institutions, Northwestern and Ohio State, both of which are rivals of Michigan, naturally. But I'll forgive you for that. Moving on. He actually, I thought an amazing accomplishment, if folks here didn't know, is that he founded both the Northwestern University Survey Lab as well as the Ohio State University Center for Survey Research. So thank you for that. Let's see, he then went over to the private sector at Nielsen, where he was the vice president, and he headed up the methodology research area there. And after 7 years in that arena and becoming rich and famous, he decided to retire into private consultancy, which he's been doing since 2007 with a variety of interesting and varied clients, including Media Rating Council, Associated Press, Google, ABC News, and the like. He did and he does have an impressive body of research that spans both policy as well as survey research and methodology, including a lot of work in the area of justice policy, elections and polling, and of course telephone surveys. Two particular milestones that I'll mention are being special editor of a special edition of POQ on cell phone number and telephone surveys, which is highly cited, back in 2007, I believe. And in 2008, being the editor of the Encyclopedia for Survey Research Methods, which is a SAGE publication. The bottom line is, and finally, he's, as you know, he's an incredible value to AAPOR in terms of his service, not only to our association, but to our research community, in terms of serving on council, teaching short courses, and the like. Final words are that when I think of Paul, and those of you who know him will know what I'm talking about, I actually have four overriding characteristics and sort of core values that he holds that I think are really special. The first is honesty. He's actually such a straight shooter that I totally admire you for that, and someday I'll try that out. It's a little too honest sometimes. The highest integrity, both professionally and scientifically. Extremely fair, so fair that he's harder on himself than he is to others. I've noted that several times. And as I said, he's totally dedicated to his family, to our profession, and to AAPOR. He's had a terrific tenure on council. I've highly valued your mentorship and look forward to seeing if I can even nominally approach your leadership there. So with that, fellow AAPOR members, I give you Paul John LeBruck.
Thank you all. I thought you were going to say anal compulsive, because that's what my son, when he was young, said was my primary characteristic. But okay, thank you. This topic today is very special to me. I've been looking forward to making a presentation about this at this arena, but in a sense, I've been working on this area, thinking about it, and it's still evolving in my mind. But I've been doing it for about 20 years, as I'll say in background here. So I'm very pleased to be speaking about this topic today. Let me give you some forewarnings in a couple of ways. I didn't write out a speech, so I don't know whether you're appalled by that. I wanted to save that until after I made this presentation and see whether it falls flat or what. And whatever feedback you can give me, I greatly will appreciate your feedback. And I'm serious about that. Those of you that may not know it, the presidential address eventually is published in Public Opinion Quarterly. And so the slides that I have are very packed with text. I'm not going to be speaking to much of the text on a lot of the slides, but it was my way of sort of starting writing my paper by doing it that way. If you're a fast reader, you'll probably get as much, if not more, from the slides as you will from what I'll be saying. So again, thank you all for being here today. All of you that are AAPOR members, thank you very much for maintaining your membership and your support of AAPOR. Oops. So I'm going to start out identifying the premises of where I'm coming from here. I, in my 35 plus years as a social scientist, have encountered enough different studies that I think that I'm accurate in saying that there are a lot of studies that get a lot of use, that are poorly conceptualized, poorly conducted, and/or poorly interpreted. And I think that the vast majority of research studies could be improved, and I don't think we're talking about substantial extra money to have that happen. Whoops, there we go. And I believe that this total error approach that I'm speaking about today will help do that. So many of you in the audience are familiar with the total survey error approach and that perspective, but some of you, maybe more than many of us would realize, are not really aware of it. So for those of you that are aware of it, the first half of my presentation in particular is going to probably be ho-hum to you, but maybe it'll be better than ho-hum. Yeah. But from what I've seen, few seem to apply the total error perspective, which underlies the total survey error perspective, broadly to the concept of research. So I'm not exactly sure why this is the case. It's so useful to me, and I hope that some of you at least will believe that it's extremely useful to you, maybe in more ways than you do right now, to take a bigger perspective on total error than just simply total survey error. So my goal today is to discuss how I've come to think about total error as a perspective that can be used across essentially all quantitative and qualitative methods. And I strongly believe that this is a way that researchers can improve the quality of the work that they do. Going back, when you heard me say this has been in the making 20 years, so I think it was 1990 when I started reading Bob Groves's the Survey Error and Survey Method cost book. I read it very slowly. I think it was an extremely important book. I personally feel it's still the most important book in our field. And it started in motion a process of thinking on my part that I didn't really recognize at the time. But probably by the mid-90s, I had gotten to the point where I realized that this total survey error model could, and in my mind, should be adapted to all kinds of research. Okay. And so when I use the phrase total error, I'm referring to all the problems that can make information gathered in a research study and the conclusions drawn about that study, all the problems that can make it wrong, unreliable or invalid, or at a minimum can undermine one's confidence or should undermine one's confidence in the study. Yeah. So total error encompasses anything that can cause the information gathered in a research study to be of questionable or limited value. And to me, it helps us answer the question is this study fit for purpose, or is it not fit for purpose? It provides researchers a way to not only plan their research, but to actually oversee their field period, the gathering the data, and at the time when they're interpreting their findings and they're disseminating their findings, I think it provides excellent guidance at every step here. And maybe the most important thing I'm saying today is that it's also a comprehensive and systematic way for any researcher to engage in a careful process of self-evaluation and improvement. To me, you could think of it as a checklist. You're thinking about doing a study. Here's a series of very logical, systematic questions to be asking and hopefully being able to answer to yourself. So many of you know already that total error encompasses both bias and variance, bias being a directional source of error, variance being all over the place, imprecise, and so forth. And total error encompasses this. For those of you that are qualitative researchers, I'm going to start out using language that you may or may not be familiar with, you may or may not buy into. And I hope that you'll see beyond the terms that I choose to use, that I believe it has application, and I'll be saying more about this later on, application to the qualitative realm. And I think a final overarching comment to make is that I believe it's better for researchers to consciously ignore issues of bias and variance than to not be aware of them or to not consider them at all. In other words, people want to say, okay, I'm not going to worry about that. At least they've made an active decision about it. So what is the schema that I use? And if you can read this thing here, and you have read the Groves et al. Book, the Groves, Fowler, Cooper, Lipkowski, Singer, and Turangen books on survey methodology, this chart will be very familiar to you. Okay. So, but I've adapted it a bit, but let me start out here. So let's talk about the representation side of research. So no matter what kind of research you're doing, you're starting out with some kind of a population that you want to represent, okay? And how are you going to represent that population? Well, you're going to have some type of a list or a frame. The more quantitative ones will call it a frame that represents that target population. And that sampling frame, you're going to then make sampling decisions about. It's going to lead you to what we could call a designated sample, the sample you start with, okay? And as you start to gather data, you're going to end up with a final sample. And how many of us have done at least one survey that had a 100% response rate? I actually, okay, wait, another hand. I actually did one. And if you're ever curious, I'd be glad to tell you what it was. So this sort of enumerates the various realms of the representation side. So what information are we gathering from people, and what are we doing with that information? Well, we're starting out with identifying constructs. What are the topics that we want to gather information about? What are their attributes and so forth? And how are we then going to operationalize or measure those constructs? What are we going to do in terms of the instrument that we're going to use to gather the actual data we're interested in? And what kind of responses do we get then from the use of this instrument? When we get those responses, how do we massage them to get them into a final data set? And then these two streams come together to provide us our final results and conclusions. So that's the big picture framework. And now let me shift to what I call the total error, what most people are familiar with, total survey error. My view is a little different, but it's mostly similar. So in between the realm of the target population and sampling frame is where coverage error becomes an issue. And when we're thinking about coverage and coverage error, we're thinking about how well the sampling frame represents the population we're interested in. And we say that non-coverage occurs when the frame is off in some way, okay? And if we're interested in the issue of within-unit coverage, well, we could have within-unit coverage issues or non-coverage. So in a telephone survey, if we're using some kind of a selection process to pick one and only one person in the household, that's what this is all about. Ultimately, what we're concerned here is if there is non-coverage, and there almost always is, if that group that's not covered by whatever list or frame we use to represent our population is different on our key statistics from the group that is covered, then we're starting out right from the start with giving us the problem of bias due to this non-coverage. Okay? If it's different in non-ignorable ways. Yeah. So go on to sampling. So we have a sampling frame. We've identified the list that we're going to use, the lists, whatever it is, and we want to then end up with a sample that we're going to start trying to collect data from. So these units and elements need to be chosen in the specific sampling design that we pick, be it a simple random sample or a multi-stage cluster sample or whatever. Issues of whether we're going to use a probability approach to selecting our units, people from the frame, or a non-probability are considerations here. What level of statistical precision you might want if this is a quantitative study. If it's a qualitative study, how certain, how many people do you need to gather data on to make you as the qualitative researcher comfortable, confident about your results? And not statistical precision, but to me, a similar concept. And how are we going to then, if we have quantitative approach to this, how are we going to go about calculating confidence intervals? So these are the issues that fit into that realm. So when we go from the sample we start out with, the designated sample, we're not going to end up typically with that data gathered from all those people. And so all the issues related to what we're familiar with, non-response, that take place here. The reasons that people, primarily don't participate is we either never contact them or when we do contact them, they refuse. There obviously are other reasons, but those are usually the two typical ones. Okay. So the difference between the designated sample and the final sample is substantially made up of unit non-response. Yeah? And if the non-responders are different and non-ignorable ways on our key variables of interest from the responders, then we suspect that we have bias due to non-response. Because they're not missing at random. That phrase might sound like an awkward phrase. I actually like it. But it's not a random subset that's missing, from the designated sample. And so this is where we get concerned about non-response bias. Something that is sometimes forgotten, that if your non-responders and your responders are really not different, then this issue of the bias and the error due to the bias is not an issue. Yeah? And then we also have a different form of non-response in which those members of our final sample who don't give us all the data that we're seeking from them, they're creating the issue of item non-response. And again, the same thing happens if you walk through this slide, that if the people that are not responding with their income are qualitatively and materially, non-ignorably different from the people that are, that even if we do things like very sophisticated imputation, we still might have bias remaining in the data. Because again, they would not be missing at random. Yeah. Finally, on the representation side, we have the realm of adjustment error. This is an area, weighting, that the quantitative people would be thinking about weighting. This is an area that I think our field needs a lot more disclosure, transparency, openness about. And that's just a side comment. So at this point, the quantitative researchers are saying to themselves, the issues related to non-coverage, if there are any, my sampling choices, and non-response, they've made my final sample no longer representative of my target population. So what can I do statistically to correct for this? And those statistical choices or approaches that the researchers use, and this is just a bias on my part, I'm going to make a side comment here, that I think too often researchers just blindly follow steps on, okay, previous researchers have decided that age, race, education, gender, that's all I have to wait for, and that must fix all the problems. Okay? Well, that's just not the case. It can't be the case. But that's what this is all about, this realm of the model. Okay, I'm going to go through here. And we get into, again, from a quantitative standpoint, we get into considerations here about design effects and effective sample size. So that's in the model where this is all coming out. And I know people would disagree. There are people that will disagree with me, but I would venture that even qualitative researchers make active choices about how to emphasize some data over other data. And I would call that being a semi-equivalent of what this is all about, the adjustment process. Yeah. Let's go over to the measurement side. So here we have, starting with identifying the constructs that we want to measure, what we want to measure. And here we have something called specification error. If we don't properly identify all the attributes or factors that make up those constructs, we might be setting ourselves up for not gathering data about the robust nature of whatever it is we're measuring. Okay? So we're interested in alienation, and we only measure a part of what alienation really is. And so this, we would say, so the researcher has created or committed a specification error. Once decisions about what constructs you want to measure have been made, how are we going to measure them? What are we going to do to actually go ahead and gather that data? So whether we're using a discussion guide or a content analysis form or a questionnaire, we have an instrument to help us. Our tool, the way astronomers are using a telescope and microbiologists are using a microscope, we're using some social scientists using some kind of tools. These are our tools. And we want these to operationalize the constructs and all their aspects and factors robustly and do it well. And we know from experience that there are so many things that could go wrong here with the wording, the ordering, the formatting of what these tools, how they're created, how they look. Yeah. Respondents that we are typically gathering data from can be a source of error for us, and that's under this measurement realm. You know, respondents are not always capable of providing us accurate information, and they're certainly not always willing to provide us accurate information, regardless of whether you're a quantitative or qualitative researcher. We have human beings often involved in the information gathering of the study. And in gathering this data, the human beings are in some way probably also creating the data for reasons that in some cases really can't be controlled, but they could be probably measured. And in a sense, after the fact, you could investigate whether some of these attributes might be affecting what the individual human being is doing to your data. So it could be something about their behavior, their beliefs, attitudes, etc., that could be conscious or unconscious that's affecting the data. Or it could be something that is immutable in a sense, their personal characteristics, such as their voice parameters. You're on the telephone and you have a voice that's signaling some type of an accent during a telephone interview, and you're alienating some people or you're causing them to answer questions differently because they've decided they really like you or they really don't like you, in some way or another. Yeah. And then, of course, the final component of measurement error is the different modes that we might use, and we're seeing more and more mixture of modes. After this, we have collected our data, but we're not ready to analyze it. We have to do things to massage that information that we've gathered in our study. Yeah? And so there are many things that we do to what I call raw data. We in a focus group, we have to transcribe the audio recordings or the video recordings. We have to take that information and put it in some form. Even if it's just mental analysis, we need to do something with it. Or we may need to impute missing data, do things like dropping bad data and so forth. Yeah? And in all of these instances, error can enter in the form of bias or variance. Yeah? And then finally, something that is important to me, I don't see it in other people's frameworks, is what I call inferential error, and it has two components to it. My background psychology, Don Campbell, I think of as probably still the top methodologist that has existed on this planet. And he and Julian Stanley wrote this tiny little book in the 60s that if you haven't seen it, Experimental and Quasi-Experimental Design, this is like, you need to read it. So they would call this statistical conclusion validity, how people quantitatively make sense of the data by the statistical procedures they choose to use, and how people, I think, qualitatively make sense of data, broadly speaking, when they're not using statistical procedures. And then finally, an issue, again, that comes from my background in psychology and steeped in experimental design is, did we use a research study that gives us strong internal validity? Did we do an unconfounded experiment that allows us to say that the study design lets us make cause and effect, causal attributions, draw those conclusions. We as researchers are going to be making cause and effect conclusions. We're going to be drawing those conclusions all the time, but most of the time we can't say that our study supports it strongly. It's our logic, our experience, our judgment, et cetera, that allows us to make those claims, not the validity of the internal validity of the study. So this is what the total error framework looks like in the big picture. Yeah. Again, hopefully it's obvious to you how you could make yourself a checklist of something like this. Yeah. So let me shift a bit to the qualitative side of how I see this being applied. I am primarily a quantitative researcher, but I've done a great deal of qualitative research from the mid-'70s to the early '90s. I did a great deal of criminal justice, federally funded criminal justice evaluation research, and we did focus groups, we did observational research, we did key person in-depth interviews, and lots of things other than surveys, the quantitative side of that stuff. And I value qualitative work a lot, the potential to enrich what we do as researchers. So most of the language, though, that I use resonates, I hope, with quantitative researchers. It may not resonate as much with qualitative researchers. And so related to this whole sort of migration of my thinking over the last 20 years, a couple of years ago, one of our AAPOR members, Margaret Roller, and Margaret's in the audience, could I just ask you to, contacted me with a question, and via my participation in AAPOR.net, and it led to a conversation, and that conversation brought us to a point where we realized that maybe we should try to write a book together, and that's what we're doing. So I thank Margaret for all I've learned from working with her. It's been, as I say here, a rewarding adventure so far. We have a book coming out in 2014, if we finish it in time, being published by Guilford. And our book uses many of the concepts that I've been talking about, using the language that I'm used to using for them. But we realized, Margaret certainly knew, Rob just showed me a 10-minute, and we said that this was good news if I were at this slide when the 10-minute sign was okay. So I want to introduce you, just show you very quickly the language that we're using in our book and how I think the total error framework fits with this qualitative terminology. Yeah. So we worked very hard on developing this framework, which we call the total quality framework for the qualitative methods book that we're doing. Made up of 4 components, interlocking. This is all Margaret's visual creation, and thank her for it. Credibility, analyzability, transparency, and usefulness. And I'm going to say something about each of them in a moment. So credibility encompasses 2 sub-areas of scope and measurement. And from my perspective, scope is how well the research you're doing represents the population, the group that you're trying to generalize to. It's what Campbell and Stanley would call broadly external validity. And from my standpoint, from the more quantitative approach, this encompasses coverage and coverage error, non-response, and sampling, these issues. And then the measurement side of credibility is what Campbell and Stanley would call construct validity, and it encompasses specification and the various specification error and all the various types of measurement error. Okay. Now, what about analyzability? We say it's the completeness and accuracy of the analyses and the interpretations that are done. And to me, this encompasses what I am talking about when I say processing error, adjustment error, and inferential error. For those of you that are qualitative researchers, these terms under verification should resonate with you. The notion of peer debriefings, reflexive journals, deviant case approach, and triangulation. And for me, again, it also, the notion of cause and effect attribution and the inferences that you may or may not be proper in making fit under here. Next, transparency. The notion that we want complete disclosure in the final documentation. And again, from a qualitative standpoint, terms like thick descriptions, rich details, and the applicability and transferability to other concepts is what, again, for you qualitative researchers, that's what we're talking about in this realm. And then finally, all of this should feed into ultimately the usefulness, and my sort of wording for the usefulness of the notion of what can you do with what your study found for you? Well, you can ultimately support or refute hypotheses that you have, notions that you have. You can refine those notions. You can generate new notions, new hypotheses. So how does this framework, how can this framework be applied to other types of research than just survey research? And I'm just going to touch on this. There's a lot more information that's here, and my written presentation will have this in much more detail. But let's take the total error approach and content analysis. And I have taught a graduate course in content analysis using a total error perspective. So for example, how many times do content analysis people think that some of the sampled content that you choose may just simply not be available because the archive that you're using is not perfect? And you go to the library and you're missing a set of newspaper articles or editions that you're looking for. How many times do people explicitly think about that? And more importantly, how often do they think about what happens when you're having the equivalent of non-response in content analysis? You know, it's not an active action of a non-response. It's a reality. The data are not there for you. And so is it possible that this is so pervasive that it's going to lead to some kind of bias? And on the measurement side of content analysis, the care with which you take to develop your coding form, the way you code if you're doing human coders, or the algorithms that you set up with your programming, how well is it really capturing, operationalizing the constructs that you're interested in? And if you have human coders, from the equivalent of an interviewer, it's the coder in the content analysis. Those humans who are creating that data by coding the content, how reliable are they? And what are you doing to measure their reliability or to correct for it? Again, the reason I've developed these charts is to suggest that all researchers who are doing content analysis should be explicitly thinking about these things and checking off that, okay, yeah, I have covered this issue, or I'm thinking about this issue. There's nothing I think that needs to be done about it. You know, active decisions like that. How about total error and in-depth interviewing? Well, let's take from a sampling standpoint. Even if you have a list that a company client gives you of their employees in which you're going to do in-depth interviewing, should you stratify that list? What information on that list will the company give you that can be appended to that list that would cause you to stratify it? Would it make it a better sample rather than simply starting with the first name on the list and continuing down the list in the order that it's given to you until you get as many of these interviews completed? It doesn't cost you really much more to do the more rigorous approach to sampling in this case, even in a non-quantitative study, to maximize the chance that you're going to be drawing a representative sample. And sticking with in-depth interviewing from a measurement standpoint, when you go to transcribe your interviews, you know, how detailed is that transcription? Is it perfect? Is it exact? What's the quality of that transcription? And how are you going to approach to making sense from it? And when you're drawing inferences, you know, what is the level and rigor of objectivity? Are you going to appear giving them the transcripts and asking them to draw their own conclusions and then comparing what did you come up with someone who probably doesn't have the vested interest that you do? How about total error and focus groups? Let's talk about coverage. how often do focus group researchers start out by saying to their client, is this the target population that you're interested in? They don't need to use that word, but are they asking that type of a question? And are they then saying, well, how are we going to cover that target population? Again, you don't have to use the word cover. You know, qualitative researchers have a term that would be better for their clients. But the concept, in my mind, is important, that you shouldn't just get the first 50 bodies that you can get, if that's the approach that you're taking. Yeah. So there's rigor here that can be brought at really very little additional cost. Okay? And how much active thinking do focus group researchers typically do when it comes to non-response? When you're inviting people to attend a focus group, they're turning you down right and left, the same way telephone researchers are getting turned down right and left. It's not just focus groups. But is there active thinking about how might the people who didn't agree to participate be qualitatively, importantly different from the people that did agree to participate? So there's parallels here, focus groups and the respondent. What are your moderators doing to make those respondents especially comfortable to express themselves and to express themselves in an accurate way? Yeah. So they won't become a major source of bias in your study. Another example would be observational research. Here, let's say sampling. So for observational research, you typically have two domains you're interested in, place or location and time. So how often do observational researchers take a very systematic approach to how am I going to sample the places I'm going to use, if that's relevant? It's not always relevant. But often the time of day is relevant for observing different behaviors. So how am I going to sample various times a day to be representative of the whole set of behavior I'm interested in? And then what about the equivalent of interviewer error would be observer error? You know, is the observer also a participant in the observational research? And if so, is this possibly biasing the information that's being gathered? It's a classic conundrum in observational research. So this is my final slide. So is that okay? Yeah? So these are examples of how I find applying a total error perspective very helpful to me. And generally, the clients I work with now as a consultant find it helpful to them. It gives them a structure that they can, if they're not facile in research, it gives them a structure that they can buy into. And I find typically that if within half an hour to an hour, I can give them an overview of the total error framework enough to make them comfortable to then start talking about the specifics. So obviously, if you're teaching any kind of research method class, I still teach a course a year part-time at Northern Arizona University, thanks to Fred Solip, if Fred is here, because we live in Flagstaff now as a primary place. And my whole class is organized around total error. And when I get to focus groups, I talk about the total error aspects. Or when I get to in-depth interviewing, I talk about that. Yeah. Whenever you're planning new research, obviously you're conceptualizing your new research, you're conducting that new research, you're analyzing that new research. That goes without saying. Now, this third bullet, I don't get involved a lot in bidding on contracts, so I don't have a broad experience. But I do recall that 1993, October, Bob Groves and I taught a course, an afternoon course on total error, total survey error, to a large group of evaluation, state-level evaluation officers. And I recommended at the time, if you're writing RFPs, why aren't you structuring them around this total error concept? And in particular, when you're scoring RFPs, why aren't you scoring it around how well did people cover the issue of non-response? How well did they cover the issue of coverage? How well did they cover the issue of waiting and so forth? It just is, to me, a great checklist. And then for those of us that do legal testimony, we don't have a lot of literature that guides how that survey-based work should do. There's a professor with the American Bar Association, and I think she's still at University of Illinois, Chicago, Sherry Diamond, who has sort of thought of as the definitive work. And she's a very good psychologist, and she's very smart about what she writes, but she doesn't cover the breadth of the total error perspective. And so there's some really conspicuous things that are missing from what most attorneys and judges know about social research in terms of potential problems. So I found it extremely useful in my legal work, whether it's to write expert reports or to plan a survey for a client so that it would hopefully hold up scrutiny, to use this entire framework. And then I'm going to go, my final comment, I'm going to go so far as that, yes, I believe this helps me in life. I think that this has direct application, these concepts have a direct application to the decisions we make in life about the information that we base those decisions on, the reliability and the validity of that. So with that said, thank you for your attention, and I appreciate the opportunity. Thank you.
And we actually have time for a question or two if anyone wishes to offer Paul a question.
And again, I welcome written input or set up a phone call by email. I'd love to have anyone give me the input, like, you stink, Lavrakis, that's okay. I need to know. I'm going to ask you, of course, why do I stink? Yeah.
Because we didn't hear about your master's thesis. Right? Okay, if there are no questions, thank you. See you at lunch,
Thank you very
guys.
much. Thank you.